afternoon and welcome to the Landfire and Lake States Fire Science Consortium webinar. Got Veggies? I'm Jeannie Patton, Communications Lead for the Nature Conservancy's Landfire program, and we're co-hosting this webinar with Lake States because Landfire is updating about 1,500 biophysical settings, vegetation models, and descriptions. And we want to offer an overview of the maps and provide information that is pertinent to this particular region. Also on the call with us today is Jack McGowan-Stinsky, whom you know. He's the program manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. Leading today's conversation is Randy Swaty of the Nature Conservancy's Landfire team. Randy is one of the ecologists who will help lead this complex, important contribution to ecological knowledge. Randy joined the TNC Michigan chapter in 2002 and the Landfire program in 2007. His scientific specialties include spatial scales from community genetics to mycorrhizal ecology and landscape scale planning. Randy has worked with federal partners and large landowners to promote sustainable management and was the Great Lakes Landfire modeling lead. He lives and works in Marquette, Michigan. Randy, the show is yours.
Thanks, Jeannie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As you may hear, I've got a little bit of something in my throat, so I apologize for my voice. And I'll try to hit mute if I start to cough. But again, I'm very glad you're here. As Jeannie mentioned, I'm an ecologist on the Nature Conservancy's Landfire team. In the next half hour, I'll introduce Landfire to you, talk about how we developed what we call the Biophysical Settings, or BPS, descriptions and models, and try to set the stage for the upcoming BPS review. So Landfire, which you may have heard of, is a program designed to create and update vegetation, fire, and fuel data for the entire United States. Leading partners include the Department of Interior, the United States Forest Service, and the Nature Conservancy, along with collaborators in the natural resources world who contribute knowledge, data, and technical expertise. Landfire supports resource management activities across the country with spatial data, vegetation models, and powerful user tools. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the spatial data sets, which you're more likely to have dealt with possibly than the biophysical settings or BPS models. Landfire uses peer-reviewed scientific methods. If you're curious, if you want, you can go into Google Scholar and find hundreds of papers where people use Landfire data, and you can find some Landfire publications to get the specifics. But Landfire uses scientific methods and delivers data sets of vegetation, fire, and fuels information for all land ownership types. Products include more than 20 geospatial layers and relational databases that support a wide range of analysis and modeling applications, whether fire-focused or not. And you can combine data sets to assess conditions on your own landscape. I want to give you a quick tour of a few of the Landfire spatial data sets, historic first. This map represents historic mean fire return interval. The spatial data sets are delivered as grids or rasters with a 30-meter pixel size. That said, the data were and are intended for large-scale use. So this map represents the Landfire biophysical settings, or where ecosystems would have occurred based on soils, climate, surficial geology, other abiotic factors, and disturbances. I left the legend off as it's pretty huge for this area. Now a couple existing vegetation data sets I want to share with you. The first is this existing vegetation type map, which basically represents nature serves ecological systems on the landscape today. Again, the legend left off due to the number of items. That said, the attribute table has a hierarchy based on the National Vegetation Classification Standards and is also crosswalked to other classification systems such as the one developed by the Society of American Foresters, Society for Range Management. Coupled with the existing vegetation type data set are data sets such as this one called the existing vegetation cover. Landfire also delivers vegetation height as well and other canopy metrics that you can get through the Landfire data set. To help paint a more complete landscape of your area, you can use these data sets mashed together, if you will. The legend here would have heights for herbaceous, shrub, and tree vegetation types. So I wanted to show you those data sets in particular because they are in some ways influenced by these biophysical settings models and descriptions that I'll be talking about in more detail today. For example, the values for the first map I showed you, the historic mean fire return interval, come from the biophysical settings models. The succession classes that I will talk about in a moment are represented on today's landscape by taking rule sets from the biophysical settings models and applying them to the existing vegetation type, height, and cover data sets. In other words, some of the spatial data sets rely on these models and descriptions. So the better the models and descriptions, the better the maps in some cases. So what is this vegetation model and description bundle that I'm talking about? These bundles, I'll call them, represent how the biophysical settings looked and worked prior to major European settlement. These models and descriptions play a major part in national vegetation mapping and assessment and on-the-ground management across the country. We are not looking at climate change with these models and are not necessarily saying that the reference conditions are the same as desired future conditions. However, we think this reference information is useful. In some ecosystems, departure from reference conditions means higher vulnerability to climate change, and we can look to the reference versus current conditions to assess what we might need to adapt. These Landfire model and description bundles are used in Landfire to understand historic disturbance patterns, estimate proportions of succession classes, get overall return intervals of surface, mixed, and replacement fires, map spatial layers, and engage experts like you. So I mentioned this two-part bundle, and I'll go into each one of these bits in more detail. The description and the ecological model. And I'm going to take just a quick break to see if there are any questions and type them in the chat window, and I'll have a sip of tea. Again, please type any questions in the chat box. I'll watch those and try to address them as needed. And right away, Michelle, with a great question I'm going to take right now. Yes, all the models and descriptions are free, available on landfire.gov, and we'll follow up with links and more information. Okay, this description, here we go, the basics. All right, so we worked with hundreds of experts across the country to describe how these biophysical settings would look and work under natural disturbance regimes, and then we did some modeling to get to some of the quantitative parts of the descriptions. So on the screen, you see a screen capture from an Access database where we collected the basic information. On this tab that you see here, the General section, you find the basic information about where these biophysical settings would occur, what the natural disturbance regimes were, a vegetation description, and information on where the biophysical setting would have occurred based on soils, geology, climate, etc. This information was typed in by experts, Dr. Nowacki in this case, often backed up by literature. As I mentioned, these descriptions were originally developed in an Access database that's online at landfire.gov. Also, you can get PDF documents of the descriptions as well. Okay, so Mark McKay asks about have the BPS models been revised? So great question, Mark. They have not been revised so far, but we're about to kick off a major revision process now. As we dig farther into the description, the textual part, you'll find these succession classes. While the general information is interesting to me, the real value added in my mind is on the Succession Classes tab. For each Landfire model and description, we developed 5 or fewer succession classes or several stages. We describe them in terms of species, disturbance, canopy characteristics, and percent of the landscape that would have been occupied by the succession classes under natural disturbance regimes. I've circled a couple items here. While these succession classes shifted around the landscape historically due to disturbance, so we did not try to develop a historic succession class map, but we do map where succession classes are today. The canopy characteristics circled on the right are important for that. Also, I wanted to point out that the percentages come from the modeling we'll discuss next. So just to kind of recap what's on the screen, I took the information for succession classes A and B from the Access database and pasted them here and circled a couple things. If I would have had a bigger screen, I would have taken a screen capture of succession classes A, B, C, D, and E so you could see them all together. In a moment, I'll talk about the modeling, which again was used to come up with these landscape percentages. And I'm going to try to draw for a moment. Yes, you see the drawing. These percentages are quantitative, developed in a model, which I'll show you in a moment. So here's a picture of what the modeling software looks like. To get an estimate of how much each succession class would have been on the landscape, we use state and transition models developed in software called Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool by ESSA Technologies. While the modeling platform has evolved, we currently use a modeling software called STSIM. The concepts are the same. Each box represents a succession class. The green lines that come out of the sides of the boxes represent succession, or what would happen if there's not a disturbance. So I'm going to circle one, sort of draw it out for you. They're a little bit hard to find. They are green, and they come out of the sides of the boxes. Disturbances, such as this replacement fire here, come out of the sides of the boxes. So you can see where in this succession class C there was some sort of disturbance that knocked it back to succession class A. Okay, I'll move on before I have too much fun with this drawing. Also in the boxes you'll see the age ranges, such as 0 to 5 in succession class A, or the middle box. And you'll see broad structural labels such as open or closed. So you may be wondering, how do you fill out these models, or how do you make them go? So our experts look to literature, personal experience, and other data to come up with information to parameterize the models. The succession classes typically represent some sort of break in development of the biophysical setting, such as when shrubs start to fill in, if there's no fire, or when a dominant tree starts to bear cones, or when the structural characteristics stabilize. For example, they become more closed canopy. The model is probabilistic, so we would enter an annual probability of a disturbance affecting a cell in a particular succession class and what happened to that cell. So for example, if you were in succession class C, perhaps closed canopy oak forest, and you had a relatively rare replacement fire, it would be entered in as the annual probability of that replacement fire happening, and then what would happen to that particular cell. So I'm probably making it sound more complicated than it is, but the software is fairly easy to play with, and so we can go at this iteratively. So we can run the model fairly quickly, adjust the disturbance probabilities, and work back and forth. So it's actually, maybe this is easy for me to say, but kind of fun to do this, and I'll be happy to do this with you at any time. The models were each run 10 times for 1,000 cells and for 1,000 years. And so we did this to make sure that the ecosystem sort of stabilized in our model before we took the numbers. So in time step 1,000, you see the percentages graphed for time step 1,000 for an example about physical setting, and we would take those numbers and import them into the text information that I showed you a moment ago. All right, so after the descriptions and the models were completed, or drafted, I'll say, we had, or I would say, a fairly high-touch, hands-on process to complete the review. The modeling delivery was intense and fast. You'll hear this a couple times because it still amazes me. We were submitting 200 to 400 pages of descriptions every 2 weeks to the Landfire team for their mapping. So it was fast and furious, and we worked really hard to collect information. So this coming review will be a more protracted experience, so we hope to get more information. While the BPS bundles were our main focus for 2 years, we know there's room for improvement. So we had experts to review models and descriptions. The reviews were incorporated into the descriptions and models, and we tried to work together with experts where there were differing opinions. And then we had an automated quality assurance, quality control process that would go through the database and look for systematic errors. And then we also had people do that as well. So we tried really hard to make these a quality product. But as I mentioned, we know there's room for improvement. So in the original Landfire mapping process, these models and descriptions were sort of the first cog in the machine of several mapping processes and really contributed to the mapping of the biophysical settings, today's succession classes, and a metric we call vegetation departure, which compares current vegetation to reference. So it was a really fast process, and these models are now, in addition to the Landfire mapping, are used for conservation planning. Several of my colleagues across the country use the models as sort of a jumping off point for assessing management into the future, and for exploring climate change even. Also, if you're familiar with the Forest Stewardship Council Forest Certification, they mention these Landfire descriptions as a information source for understanding what your landscape used to look like. And here's a screen capture of one of my favorite publications where Greg Lowe, Louis Provencher, and Susan Abel really took the modeling to the next level, where they would take the reference condition models, add in current disturbances or changes to disturbances such as fire suppression, and then would test out various potential management regimes into the future, adding in a dollar component so they could work with their partners to come up with the most cost-effective management plans. Okay, so why review? If you guys have looked at these descriptions, you'll see some blunders. I taught a class at Northern Michigan University last fall and had students, for example, find blunders. They were great at this because they were curious and great readers. So they're just some blunders that we call mistakes that we want to correct. We know there's new science, and also there were some missed opportunities. I'll be the first to admit that I was unable to always grab all the review that I got the first time, reconcile different opinions, and get the reports in time. So I know there were some missed opportunities. I want to try to seize those again. There's potential for an upgraded delivery system. We haven't gotten that worked out yet. It may look the same as it does today, but there's some potential there. And also, as I mentioned, we're using STSIM modeling software, and it has a lot more potential than VDDT did, especially if you're looking at climate change modeling. So anyways, there's a lot of reasons for review, and we're excited to engage with all you guys to make these models and descriptions better. So here's sort of the basic philosophy of Landfire and our team. The biophysical settings review and users will equal better products. We expect that, if you have 10 minutes or days to contribute to this, you can make a difference. So we're going to be going through this process over the next year, year and a half, and we hope to engage with all of you. Here's sort of the process. Right now, Jim Smith, who is on the call, myself, and our colleague Corey, who is out west, Corey Blankenship, who's out west, are what we call cleaning the models. So, for example, there are several models that are called Laurentian, Acadian, Northern Hardwoods Forest. And some of those are duplicates. some of those are near duplicates, meaning they really have very little different. And then there are, obviously different models as well in that set of Northern Harwoods models. So we're going through and we're lumping the duplicate models and assessing the near duplicate models. So we hope to sort of do this housekeeping, and while tedious, it's already been rewarding for Jim, Corey, and I because we've really cleaned up the model set. Once we get that completed, we're going to post them to a website that we're building where you'll be able to go in, download the Word documents, and use your track changes and go through and make changes at your office. We'll also host WebExes and try to be super available via phone and email and Skype, Google Chat, whatever to work with you. And we also anticipate some in-person meetings. So we'll get the review from you guys. We'll try to reconcile differences and incorporate it the best we can. And then the review will be delivered via website, and again, that's to be determined. It may look the same as it does today with PDFs and an Access database, or it may be something more sophisticated. So with that, I want to definitely address any questions, comments, concerns, ideas that you have, and leave this sort of contacts page up in case you want to write it down. As you probably know, this WebEx is being recorded. We're happy to send the slides to you, and if you email landfire@tnc.org, Jeannie, who introduced us today, will sort of move your email to the right person to address any questions you have if you don't ask today. So thanks so much for listening to my raspy voice and for sitting in today, and I'll take questions. So John Polo, thank you. No, I have not heard of Git. That's something we'll look into. It's really not easy to figure out exactly how to do this. So thanks, John. I'll check into that. Any other questions or ideas or concerns? I see some typing, so I'll hang in. Okay, thanks, Michelle. She asked about climate change. Okay, the models as I'm presenting them today are not spatial. That is, these models, while they feed into spatial mapping, do not generate a spatial output. So they're state and transition models that can be linked to your local data and made spatial, but they're not, as I talked about them today. So for climate change, what people do is they will increase fire, for example, going into the future, or increase pests based on the best research they can find. They will also, the people have accelerated some succession pathways. So basically, if you have literature or knowledge or a guess or just even a hypothesis about how a disturbance will change going into the future or succession, you can model that. Also, the Landfire models as we deliver them are only up to 5 succession classes. But people in Forest Service planning, for example, have created mega models that have many boxes. For example, in our oak forest, we know that red maple is coming in. It's a huge component. Landfire didn't map a succession class of red maple in the oak forest because that was, it may have been, red maple may have been a component of the oak forest, but it wasn't a dominant tree. So in the future, to do climate change modeling or just future modeling with fire suppression, you might add in a new succession class that would be a red maple dominated succession class. So if you can imagine what a succession class will look like in the future and come up with disturbances or alter the disturbances that are in there, you can model it. If you use STSIM with the spatial components added in, there are also many more variables you can control, such as spread and patch size and things like that. So Terry Gallagher asked a great question. Will there be announcement for when certain BPS information is ready for review? The way we imagine this going is that we'll get all the documents ready for the country and they'll be posted. And we'll have an Excel spreadsheet is kind of the plan now that will allow you to search for the models and descriptions you're interested in looking at. For example, if you're interested in looking at the central tallgrass prairie, you'll be able to search this Excel spreadsheet and click on a link and then download the Word document. It's sort of what we're imagining now. So there will definitely be announcements. We'll try not to flood you with announcements of when these documents are ready. And we imagine that they'll all be sort of put out and ready at the same time is sort of the thought now. John asked a question, are there any plans for Landfire review in the western states? It's going to be for all biophysical settings across the country. And Jim, Corey, and I are we have different areas that we're focusing on, and we'll be working real hard over the next 18 months to do that. But it's for all the biophysical settings for the country. I saw some more typing. To see, okay. Jerry asked a question, Landfire is being used in a lot of unexpected ways. Yes, Jerry, I see that. Gosh, if you guys watch Google Scholar, it's really amazing to see what people are doing with Landfire data. And most of it, I think, is really legit, large scale with data review and all that. And he asked, are there any plans to get input from a wider audience? That's a great point, Jerry. Yes, I think, I mentioned missed opportunities the first go around. Honestly, I came from a forest background and studied mycorrhizae, so I was not aware enough of the fire community the first time around. So I'm actually excited to reach out to you guys because I don't think I did enough of that the first time. We will be posting on Ecolog. We're trying to market this more as a vegetation basic ecology kind of thing, because you're right, Jerry, it contributes to just basic ecology. So we're trying to broaden audience that way. Any ideas are very appreciated for getting the word out and getting a review. And we're going to try to spread it out. That's going to be a challenge for us because we want a review of all the biophysical settings, not just 20 people reviewing the northern pine oak model. We do need a review of that northern pine oak model, but in Michigan, there's going to be probably 20 to 25 biophysical settings models to review, for example. And we'll want review of all of them. Okay, more typing. These are great questions, so I'm definitely looking forward to more if you have them. John, another interesting question. Do you know of any research that has used Landfire data with planning scenario software like ecosystem management decision support? I'll be curious if anyone else knows about this particular use. I know that Landfire has been an input for fire behavior work. I'm collaborating with folks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who used the Landfire spatial data and the VDDT models in Tulsa. So basically you would use the Landfire models, update them for the current world, with logging, invasives, fire suppression, those sorts of things. And then you would import in the Landfire spatial data and then start running Tulsa. And we used it to test various conservation scenarios in the eastern Upper Peninsula and in northern Wisconsin. So there are examples of that. And if you go into some of the literature, you'll see that as well. But I'm not familiar with this EMDS though, so I'm gonna want to check into that. So Michelle, yes, it's she asked, not so much of a spatial thing, not data to download. Today I've focused on mostly the non-spatial part of Landfire, which is these state and transition models. However, Landfire does deliver tons of spatial data. So if you go to landfire.gov, you can click on, there's buttons on the top that have say things such as vegetation, disturbance, reference, fire. And the data sets are pretty amazing. So you can go in and download the fuels data sets that Landfire has created. I really like using the existing vegetation type, height, and cover together. So you can go into ArcGIS and mash those together, and for fun, you could create a Sasquatch habitat map if you wanted to. I'm seeing a lot of wildlife biologists use the Landfire data in that way, where they'll go in, they'll define rule sets for a particular species, and then mash the Landfire data together, filter it for areas that have those particular habitat species, and then most of the time they're doing great work. Well, they'll also go out and do plots in those areas to make sure that the data held up. And it seems to work pretty well for if you're using it at the right scale. So yes, Michelle, I would love to talk with you more about your particular situation and ideas and give you tours of the data or help you, explore it for your area. That's kind of what we do. So contact us if you want to learn more about anything Landfire. All right. Kay has a great question. I realize that the data is meant for larger areas in a single park. However, if we can assign a BPS to our existing vegetation data of our site, would it be appropriate to apply the models to the BPS that we have been able to delineate as reference sites? Okay, so there's kind of a lot going on in that question. It's one of those things I'm not typically a splitter, meaning I don't dig into, I'm not so much a detailed person, but a couple of things I'll mention. So I would say that if you have reference sites or plots, it would be worth downloading the biophysical settings descriptions and reading them and seeing if they fit your plot labels. For example, you may have to do some crosswalking. And then with great care, if you've reviewed the biophysical settings descriptions and models and you fit them to your spatial data, they may be of some value. Again, the models don't include modern disturbances such as logging or, if there's more flooding now or less flooding now, they don't include that. They're strictly kind of pre-European settlement, but they might fit together and provide valuable information. So I would be really interested in seeing what you're up to, Kay, and get a tour of your data, and I can give you a more specific tour, and we can explore it together. The graph I usually try to draw is that the smaller your area that you're working in, the more review it takes. For example, the Hiawatha National Forest has done some mid-scale work, and they wanted to go down to the tens of thousands of acres, 20,000 acres. And we reviewed the data a lot, and we really understood the strengths and weaknesses of it. And so I felt comfortable doing some work at that scale, but that was after a lot of expert review and sort of overlaying it on Google Earth images and their plot data, their inventory work. So we can always do more, and we're in a process of reviewing the data more. So yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really good one. The scale thing is tricky. There's a condition called my favorite pixel syndrome that I talk about a lot, where you show people a map, they drill into where they love to take their family on picnics or that one stand they've been managing for 20 years, and if Landfire gets it wrong, they dismiss the data set. And that's very understandable, but a lot of times what you need to do is go in and review the data in more detail. We have people call us, and it's largely based on our need to improve on our communication, but they'll mix up a description and a data type. So they think Landfire is saying one thing when it's saying another. We have those issues. Sometimes the Landfire data really could use improvement, and sometimes it works great. So it's highly variable. I would say the Landfire email contact on this last slide, send your questions there, and Jeannie will send it to the Landfire team, and we'll sort things out. For example, if you have questions about remote sensing or GIS specific things, it might be Jim Smith, or if it's fire ecology and adjusting Landfire data, it might be Corey, for example. So send it on to the landfire@tnc.org email, and we'll all take a look and join in, unless there's just some huge flood of emails, which we haven't experienced yet. So we're happy to all take a look and get back to you. Well, it looks like the questions have slowed down. This has been a really great discussion. I really appreciate the very relevant and meaningful questions. I see a little bit more typing there. Do stay in touch, and I'll watch for the next question. It's like, oh, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Randy. So I guess with that, maybe we'll conclude. Check in for the recording if you want. Call us, email us, and we'll explore the data more. And please set aside some time over the next year to help us out with this BPS review. Many thanks to you all. And with that, I guess we'll conclude this presentation.